Breda Čebulj Sajko is ethnologist, and she does research in Australia, and she looks on the Slovenians in Australia, how their identity is splitted. In Slovenia, she is research advisor at the Center of Interdisciplinary Research of the Slovenian Academy of Science and Arts. So, her topic is a nice introduction, maybe, to our next conference in Australia. Please, start.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Well, maybe I will be 3 or 4 minutes. I will take a little more time, and I'm sorry I have no PowerPoint presentation. So, and my presentation is more or less a story. When talking about the development of Slovenian education among Australian students, it is necessary to mention that the Slovenian immigrants in Australia are among the smallest ethnical communities of the country. According to an assessment of Society for Slovenes Abroad, there were about 25,000 Slovenes living in Australia in 1972. Of these, approximately 6,000 in Sydney and 5,000 in Melbourne, and the rest in Canberra, Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, Mount Isa, Darwin, Cairns, and elsewhere. According to Australian census of 2001, there are only about 17,000 Australians of Slovene origin. Regardless of the difference in the numbers, Slovenians only began immigrating to the fifth continent in bigger numbers after World War II. They arrived in different intervals up to the end of the 70s of the 20th century. Most of them immigrated in the 60s, that is in the era of illegal border crossings of former Yugoslavian borders, and in the time of favorable immigration policy towards new immigrants in Australia. The flow of immigrants stopped completely in the 80s in the previous century and has begun to pick up again recently. Because of the hard economic situation in their homeland, Australia presented a better economic future for the Slovenian immigrants, personal freedom for some, and for many, an adventure. Most of them originated from the rural and border areas of Slovenia, from where they escaped to refugee camps near the borders of Austria and Italy, and from there emigrated to the fifth continent as refugees or displaced persons with the aid of refugee organizations. In Australia, they began their new lives as new Australians in assembly camps in the coastal areas of Victoria and New South Wales, from where the men left for work in the interior of the continent, and the women with the children in mind in the cities as maids, nannies, etc. The arrival to an English-speaking environment was for many Slovenes a shock. All was different: climate, language, food, habits. That is why the everyday life in the first few years after immigration was dedicated to the struggle for survival and economic independence. In this time, the desire to return to the homeland was understandably fraught with feelings of alienation and loneliness in their new environment. The wish to communicate in their mother tongue, the longing for their families and at home and for a homeland atmosphere were the main levers for mutual linking of Slovenian immigrants beginning in the 5th and continuing in the 60s of the previous century. It was in that time that Slovenian associations were first formed. Both pastoral centers in Melbourne and Sydney and religious newspapers started to be published. We can follow the peaks of Slovenian organized operation in the 70s and 80s. At that time, most of the immigrants already had families, safe economic and social life, and communication in English was not the basic problem anymore. The involvement of the immigrants in the ethnically heterogeneous Australian society was also promoted by multiculturalism, which replaced the policy of assimilation towards new arrivals in the 70s. In the outline social circumstances, the first attempts to establish Slovenian schools already appeared in the 50s, but they actually gained momentum only at the end of the 60s and developed further in the following 2 decades. I will illustrate their development and importance for preservation of ethnical identity with the example of 2 life stories of the deceased teachers Jože Čujež and Marisa Ličan, both of whom worked among Slovenian immigrants in Sydney. They were both central personalities of the pedagogical, social, culture and media life not only in the New South Wales, but among Australian Slovenes in general, right up until their deaths. Čujež passed away in 1995 and Ličan in 2001. The former was an initiator, founder and organizer of the entire Slovenian culture movement from the late 40s all the way to the end of the 80s. The latter was at first his helping hand, but became his successor and the driving force behind the pedagogical and media movement among the Slovene community. Their stories, which I record in the beginning of the 80s in Sydney and supplemented in the 90s during my time of field work and study in Australia, complement each other in the time frame and content and both reveal what we are most interested in today's presentation, the development of Slovenian education in Australia, specifically in the state of New South Wales. So Jože Čujež, teacher by occupation, was born 1923 in Štajerska region in Slovenia. His activities during the Second War were reason enough to escape across the border. In May 1945, he joined other refugees in Manica in Austrian Carinthia. During the 3.5 years he had spent among Slovene refugees in different Austrian refugees camps, he worked as editor of the first Slovene newspaper in Austria, called Carinthia Chronicle. He also participated in Slovene radio broadcasts for Carinthian Slovenes and tried to introduce Slovene to bilingual schools. His departure for Australia had been prompted by his meeting with an Australian major in the Spital camp. I quote, "So he said to me, listen, if you think of going somewhere, go to Australia. It's a good country, with lots of sun, work, lots of life," unquote. On the evening of June 21st, 1949, Čujež was one of many refugees whose ship reached the Sydney harbour. For sure, he was one of the earlier post-war Slovene immigrants to Australia. These were his first impressions of the new country and its people. I quote, "I remember it was cold, it was in the middle of winter, and very rainy. And when we saw those dockers who had potatoes wrapped in newspapers, what we now call chips, Slovenes remarked to one another that this must be an awful wild country." Unquote. After he had landed on Australian soil, he stayed in Bathurst, one of the largest assembly camps for new immigrants in Australia. From there he came with some other refugees to an abandoned military camp close to Sydney when he got his first job. Čujež volunteered to clean the toilets, courtyard, the kitchen, peeled potatoes, and learned English. In next camp, St. Mary's, which is now a suburb of Sydney, he worked as an office employee, and there his work with Australian Slovenes began. Until his retirement and illness in 1987, Čujež remained continuously involved with the development of Slovene activities in Australia, especially in Sydney. According to his urgent wish to become a teacher teaching Slovene immigrants or a cook, I will speak now only about his work connected to Slovene schools. Since in 1950s and 1960s, immigrants were not receiving any financial support from the Australian government for organized activity in their mother tongue, for this was the period of pressure for non-Anglo-Saxons to assimilate. All such activities were either performed under the patronage of religious events or were initiated by individuals. Since 1956, Jože Čujež taught Slovene with the support of a Slovenian priest and some other volunteers who were originally qualified teachers. Classes were taught after Sunday Mass and took place in rented, most often church halls in the Sydney areas with a large Slovene population. The school was named after the Slovenian bishop Slomšek. So it became known as Slomškova šola. It was a cross between religious instructions, a kindergarten and Slovenian language classes, and the classes catered to the very young children. In 1964, Čujež wrote and published a textbook for the teaching of Slovenian language. It was called Prvi koraki, First Step, and was published by the oldest Slovenian club, the Slovenian Association Sydney, established in 1957. In that time, classes of Slomškova šola existed in 6 Sydney districts. Classes in overage contained 20 students of different ages who had different prior knowledge of Slovene. Children aged 7 or more proved their knowledge of the language in written and oral examination at the end of the year, while the younger children wrote, and those who were not proficient in that had to point out where the closet, broom, and windows were. In that time, Čujež pursued his pedagogical work in 2 classes, in Ponder Park and in Kabramaka. Mostly teachers taught Slovene with his textbook, but they also received some teaching materials from Slovene immigrants in Argentina, and they also considered the wishes of their pupils. In the 70s, Slovene classes also exist in both Slovenian associations, in the early mentioned Slovene Association Sydney and in the Slovene Club Triglav established in 1972. Slomškova šola found new space in the new religious center, named St. Raphael Mission Center. It was the longest functioning Slovene school in New South Wales up until 2009. The 70s were landmark years for the development of Slovenian education in Australia. It was in this decade that the extremely fruitful collaboration between Čujež and Vičan began. Her story of life in Australia in that crucial time is pretty short due to her arrival in 1966. So, Marisa Vičan was born in 1945 in Primorska region of Slovenia and was a teacher by occupation. She migrated to Australia due to her wedding in 1966, as already mentioned. At first she lived in the Snowy Mountains where her husband done a foreman on one of the construction sites for the enormous hydroelectric plants project on which men were only employed. Marisa spent her time learning English, helped out with kitchen work, and otherwise lived a pretty lonely life. In search of better employment for Marisa's husband, they left for Chile in 1967 and returned to Australia in 1971. They bought a house in Sydney, and there they first made contact with other Slovenian immigrants in Australia. Their return to the continent coincided with Čuješ's initiative to create a new Slovenian association in Sydney, Triglav Club, and Marisa never became regularly employed and was always economically dependent on her husband, who retired as an invalid in 1977 and who was strongly supported her work for the Slovenian Association right until her death in 2001. Immediately after the establishment of Triglav, the Vičans became indispensable members of the club. In 1972, Triglav Supplementary School started its work and Marisa became a lifelong teacher and driving force of the school. From here on, we can follow the joint story of Vičan and Čujež in the field of Slovenian education in Australia. They were connected in their work by a joint interest, raising awareness of preserving ethnical identity in children through the learning of Slovene language. Due to the fact that Čujež had been active in Australia since 1948 and Vičan only just began working in 1972, there were some differences between two. As already mentioned, Čujež was the founder or co-founder of most of the activities of Slovenian Association in New South Wales, while Marisa arrived among her fellow Slovenian immigrants in a time when most of the activities were already well underway. Further, Čujež only visited Slovenia once in 1990, 5 years before his death, while Marisa conducted almost yearly visits to her family and to Slovenian institutions connected to activities of Slovenian immigrants, and was keeping track of the developments in the homeland. She brought fresh news and new textbooks to the immigrants in Australia and updated the content and method of language instructions for the mother tongue. In this way, she created a lasting connection between the younger generations of Slovenian Australians in the homeland of their parents. That is why the Triglav school was in the 70s already one of the most visited Slovenian schools in New South Wales. Classes were, besides language instruction, also dedicated to history and geography of Slovenia. The pupils were also members of folkloric groups, chorus, etc., and had an important role at celebrations of cultural holidays, where they performed in traditional folk dress, recited Slovenian poems, etc. In this decade, Australia began gradually implementing its policy of multiculturalism towards to the non-Anglo-Saxon residents. The positive effects of this policy were also visible in the development of ethical education. The country began with financial support of Saturday supplementary classes of mother tongues. Saturday School of Community Languages was set up in 1978 to facilitate the learning of languages other than English. To take advantage of this opportunity, the Slovenian community in New South Wales established the Slovenian Schools Committee for New South Wales. In the following year, the committee already reached its goal. Slovenian was accredited as a subject taught in Saturday schools of community language, and classes were established in Ashfield and Bankstown. The former school ended its existence after only 2 years due to the lack of students and also a lack of qualified teachers. But the Bankstown school, where Marisa Lichan had her class, functioned from the 80s all the way to year 2000. Slovene language was taught on both primary and high school levels and became an accredited elective graduation subject. Between 1979 and 2000, 159 students graduated from Slovenian language. Most of them were prepared for the graduation exam by Marisa Lichan, who became one of the most successful teachers of the language in the Saturday schools of community language and also president of the committee for many years. In the past 2 decades, quite a few graduates took the seminar about teaching Slovenian that is organized by the Department for Slovenian Language on the Faculty of Arts of University of Ljubljana. As a result, the gained knowledge was reflected in their successful teaching in Saturday supplementary schools for Slovenian language, at least until this case exists at the end of the 90s. The main reason for this closure was the loss of interest students. One of the peaks of operation for the Slovenian Schools Committee for New South Wales can easily be the establishment of the Slovenian language lectureship within the Slavonic Studies program at the Macquarie University in Sydney. For this purpose, the committee established a Slovenian fund to provide the financial support for lectureships. Regardless of this community support and support from Slovenia, this lectureship encountered financial difficulties throughout its existence. It existed for 10 years between the year of 1989 to 1999. In this time, Jože Čuješ died and Marisa Lichan got cancer. Despite her illness, she remained an active teacher up until the last graduation class in 2000. After the death of Čuješ, she took over the leading role in the cultural life and was also a very successful manager of Slovenia radio shows on the national radio. With this, I am finishing my overview about the teaching of Slovenian language in New South Wales, which started from the very beginning to the university level. Today, there is no Slovene classes in New South Wales. The overview actually does not open many new issues, but just tells us about a small ethnical community which in comparison was as successful as many of the far-flung cities. But we do need to ask ourselves something. In light of the cessation of Slovenian language instructions in New South Wales, is knowledge of the language in fact the most important indicator of ethnical identity of a particular immigrant community? At this time, we do not yet have in-depth analysis on this subject. Perhaps already decades ago, Čuješ best described the current situation. I quote, "For me, my homeland is the one that is there, in Slovenia. And I always keep in mind that this same Slovenia, these same people are there and are here in Australia. We are bound by something, not the language. The language is not what is most important. More important is the awareness that we have something in common. I may be sentimental or whatever, but Australians put it this way. This is a state of mind. Of this I am certain. We live with this. Unquote. The future of Slovenian education in Australia, if it begins anew, is in learning about Slovenian culture in the broadest sense of the word, from which the parents of the younger generations of Slovenian Australians derive. It is about preservation of awareness about the origin of the first Slovenian immigrants to the fifth continent, which is the connecting line between the youth on this and the other side of the world. Thank you.